Hi, I'm J.John. I'm here at the Evangelists Conference and I'm delighted to welcome in this session Rachael Heffer.
And then he told them, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to everyone."
Now, a little thing about me is that I spend far too much time on trains. Anybody else? Quite a few of you. And I love train travel. I've already had conversations today with Mark here and his lovely wife about the Bernina Express. Has anyone been on that? Bernina Express train, which goes from Switzerland to Italy or vice versa. Absolutely beautiful train in Switzerland, where trains run on time. And they're actually more reliable. But in this country, I've found that particularly over the last year, train travel can be a risky business. I have travelled, I'm based in London with my work, so I'm generally down, I go from Ely to London about twice a week. And in some of my other ministry and work, it takes me all over the place. And in the course of the last year, probably like many of you, I have seen train strikes on more than a few occasions. Trains that were on the timetable an hour later have just completely disappeared. Baffling what happened to it. Train drivers not turn up, trains derailed, and worse, of course, as you can imagine. But in the course of those journeys, it strikes me that actually, whilst unenviable, there's something to be learned from train travel, I believe. And I was praying back in early December, as many of our friends were as well, about, Lord, what would you have me say to these people on this day, in this moment, at the Evangelists Conference? And God, in his kindness and graciousness, actually very quickly gave me a really strong picture, which was this, as you can see on your screens. It was a sense of we need to pull the emergency cord. Now, I don't know, again, if you can think or picture a train. It's sometimes a cord, it's sometimes an emergency button. But the Lord led me to think of 3 occasions over this last year that I've been on trains that have had to hit an emergency button or pull the cord and come to an abrupt halt. Now, I'll go on to explain to you what I felt the Lord said, but let me share you a little bit about these trials and tribulations on trains. So one occasion was back in the spring of last year. I was over with our wonderful EA Welsh family and the team there, and we were looking at the Talking Jesus research with a bunch of leaders in Cardiff. And then we got on a train, myself and other colleagues, and we were travelling from Cardiff to Chester. Well, midway along the track, what happened? Our train came to an emergency halt because it hit a tree. What are the chances? And you can imagine, if you come to a screeching halt on a train, of course, everyone's sort of looking around at each other, thinking, my goodness, what on earth has happened? Who knows the answers to the question? And what ended up happening was we sat for about an hour, whilst, of course, we waited to hear what was going to happen with the tree on the track, and then we were able to get on our way. So that was one occasion. That was in spring last year. Second occasion was just after the summertime, I think, of 2024, and I was on another train. And again, the emergency cord was pulled. It came to a complete and sudden halt, and it was because a man in the carriage just ahead of me had taken really unwell, and it turned out that this guy was diabetic. So a voice, as you can imagine, came across the tannoy saying, "Any doctors on the train? Who can come and help? We're in this carriage." And we sat at a standstill for probably, again, another 45 minutes or so, whilst this man was being attended to, thankfully, by a doctor or a nurse who were on the train. Eventually, we heard the rumours along the rest of the track told us that the man had been made well again. He was diabetic. He needed to get off at the next station. But thankfully, all was well, and we carried on along our route. The third occasion was just before Christmas. It was in December last year, and I was 3/4 of the way of my normal journey from Ely into King's Cross. And just as I could almost see King's Cross ahead of us, we again came to a complete emergency halt. And again, you hear the ripples around you. You can imagine people grumbling, thinking we're going to be late and so on. And the reason for that was, as the voice came over the tannoy, there was a broken rail ahead. And so not only could we not go any further, I know I'm very unfortunate on trains, aren't I? The moral of this tale is don't get on a train with me. But what we were told was there was a broken rail ahead, and not only could we not go any further, but we actually needed to go more than 3/4 of the way back up the track. Exactly, thank you for the sympathy vote. But to go back up the track, to reroute, and to go what we were assured was going to be a faster line into King's Cross. So again, what does all of this tell us? Trains are not altogether that reliable, are they? But why do I share this with you? Because I really felt in praying for today that actually the Lord really made me think of that emergency cord. When do you pull an emergency cord on a train? Well, it's when there is some imminent danger, isn't there? When something needs to be aborted, halted, cut off. When actually there's negativity or worry or anxiety or something that people feel fearful about on the track ahead. It's something, isn't it, where intervention is needed and it needs to happen immediately in that moment. The reason I tell you this is not just to tell you stories of train travel, it's because I really felt and have carried with me for the last month or so, querying the Lord and saying, what does this speak to us? Actually, I believe it ties in very well with what Julie shared, because the picture that I had in mind was about this sense of spiralling. As you spoke about the whirlwind just earlier to us, or the whirlpool rather, this sense of spiralling sometimes into negative emotion, into dangerous territory, into places where actually we just need to recognise it for what it is and take drastic action to cut it off and take an altogether different route. And for me, what I felt as I leant into that and prayed for all of us as to what that meant, it felt to me that whether sometimes in a room of evangelists, we might be sitting here thinking, we're the energised, positive bunch, aren't we? We always have that positive outlook, knowing that God's in control, seeking for people to come to know him. But actually, it's not always true, is it? And even if it is true for us, on behalf of the people that we represent and our wider church communities, often we can see people, can't we, feel demoralised, uncertain, worried, anxious, as they look at the wider landscape or even at the church. And it made me think about, actually, when we look at the wider landscape, where might we feel somewhat demoralised or spiralling into this sense of doom or of anxiety? Well, it might be that as we look as parents, as grandparents, as godparents, as youth ministers, as church leaders, as we look at the wider landscape of our cultural contested times, it might bring about that sense of feeling demoralised. What's going on, Lord? Where are you? How are these conversations going to unravel and where will they end? It might be on occasions that we look at divisions in the church. In part, we know other parts of the church are flourishing and growing, but there are those divisions, and sometimes that can cause us to feel demoralised, hurt, pained as we look at some of these as well. It may be that we hear all too often about leadership failures that really pains our heart as well, or the challenges even between denominations or across the institution of the British Church. And it may well be that actually as we hear and we heed sometimes, all too often, the media's reporting, which, dare I say, bit of a soapbox moment of mine, isn't the media about the church always so negative? And yet, as we know through research and so on, it's rarely true what is said. And so sometimes in all of that, I wonder whether we can sometimes believe that all is lost, that we're not heading in the right direction, that it's a downward spiral, and we can feel somewhat demoralised. And I guess my encouragement in sharing some of that with us today is that actually, friends, I believe that we can hold every thought captive, can't we? We can cut it off. And whether it's us or whether it's people in our community, the truth is, isn't it, and my sensing from the Lord is that we can pull the emergency cord. That whether it's on our behalf, people in our family, people in our communities, we can help them to curtail that, to cause that abrupt halt. And why do we do that? Because we're called, aren't we, as Christians, to not despair. The church is not dying, is it? The church is fully alive in many areas, both across the UK and the globe. It is growing exponentially. And we know, don't we, looking at both present and past and knowing with God's promise to the future, that the church isn't dying, it never will die, and it's not ours, is it? It's in the Lord's hands. So part of my encouragement to myself and to you today is to look at, as we look out, where culture pushes and pushes and pushes us, doesn't it? Historically, as we look, culture always swings back. So surely the charge on us is to not despair, to not be demoralised, but to actually seek the Lord of the harvest in all of this, knowing that actually he is in control. And we only need to look back briefly, don't we, at Bible times to see that there's nothing new under the sun, is there? That people have always faced struggles, sometimes demoralised and so on. And yet Jesus has always pointed to his Father God and pointed to God's everlasting provision, hope, love, leadership and his grace. Just briefly, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking even in the Bible where we're told about, for example, fishermen's lives completely bulldozed, weren't they, and turned upside down and turned around. We see that where there could have been despair, actually prostitutes were redeemed and given hope. We saw authorities questioned, just as we mentioned, many of us are still doing today, again, seeking God for wisdom in the midst of that. We see that tax collectors were set on an honest and righteous track when their lives turned around. We see people at sea, just like our friend Jonah, go from disobedience into a place of obedience, seeking God however big the cost was. We see shepherds becoming giant killers. Why do we think that anything we face is outside of God's control? It's just not, is it? God is a God, as we know, who can overturn negative situations. And I'm sure that you as leaders, as ministers, see them all around you. And it pains your heart, I'm sure, on a weekly, monthly basis in the pastoral situations that many of us are involved in. And yet in the midst of that, can't we lean on the fact that God is a God of hope and not despair? Let me say that again. God is a God of hope, isn't he, and not despair. And I really feel at the start of a new year, what better time but to re-envision and reignite that in ourselves, that God is a God of almighty, everlasting hope. And against a backdrop that often would call us into despair, let's pull that emergency cord and sometimes cut it off to prevent that spiraling, as we heard of earlier. I'd love to briefly just take us to the story of Joshua. Again, looking at some of the Bible context of people's lives overturned. And I've been struck in reading Joshua just 1 and 2, that at the end of Deuteronomy, as many of you all know, we see the death of Moses, don't we? And Moses died in the land of Moab just as it had been foretold and came to be. And in Deuteronomy 34, verse 10, it said that there'd never been another prophet in Israel like Moses. As I read that, I thought, wow, that's something to live up to, isn't it? But also something to be said about Moses, because we learn that he'd performed, and we know the stories, he'd performed all these miraculous signs and the wonders in Egypt to Pharaoh and to the people of Israel across the entire land. And despite his early wobbles in leadership, we see that it tells us that he performed terrifying acts in the sight of all of Israel. And the reason I mention this is because it made me think about the character of Moses, thinking, the character of Joshua. What happened to Joshua and in his own mindset when Moses died? Now, I don't know about you, but if you put yourself into that position, I think I'd have felt slightly worried at that point. Actually, Moses, despite his not wanting to step into leadership, the reluctant leader and God calling him out, actually had become an amazing leader, hadn't he, seeking the heart of God. And yet when Moses died and Joshua had been his teenage into his adult years and some accompanier, I wonder how he felt. Because gone were the days of Moses. If that was me, I would have asked, do the blessings of Moses' hand go? Does the anointing go when he dies? What becomes of the people of Israel now? What is my part to play? And he too might have had that sense of actually this whirlpool of despairing, of what now and so on. But of course we see that just wasn't the case, was it? God always had a plan. And what we see, as you can see on the verse on your screen, it says this, that the Lord spoke really clearly to Joshua in that moment, didn't he? And he said this, he said, Moses, my servant, is dead, but therefore the time has come for you, to lead these people into the land that I am giving them. I promise you what I promised to Moses. Wherever you set foot, you will be on land that I have given you. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will not fail or abandon you. Ooh, that's a promise and a half, isn't it? Again, I wonder how Joshua felt in having heard that. Love those verses that, to my mind, just call out that great commissioning of Joshua for such a time as this. For him, in the light of Moses having died, that trepidation that he must have felt. And yet again, God going to Joshua and saying, it's over to you now, mate. But you are going because I've called and I've equipped you, and there is no reason to fear, because as it says, I will stand with you. Does it say, I will be with you as I was with Moses for as long as you live? So just as my train was halted and the emergency cord pulled in that moment, I just wonder what that might look like for us today, or maybe those that we serve, like I said, actually to halt any negative thinking, but to recognise again that all is not lost in this season. That whilst we face great challenge, again, these are urgent times, aren't they, where we need to step up and step in together. That's the important bit, isn't it? We don't do it alone, commissioned by God, yes, but we do it together. We need to recognise, as Joshua did, the call of God on our lives and be renewed maybe, even today maybe, renewed into that confidence of how we do this. And lastly, that analogy of what does it look like maybe sometimes for us to go back up the track, that train of mine, 3/4 of the way in, hurtling in one direction, and yet aborted, halted, stopped. But actually that sense, I wonder whether for some of us, we need to actually go back up the track, remembering what God has done in his faithfulness, to then, as my train had to, reroute and then take a speedier action to the point of destination. As we said, these are urgent times, and actually I just pray that as we reflect, we'll have that charge, that call again that helps us go in greater confidence. Psalm 27 verse 14 reminds us, doesn't it? Trust in the Lord, have faith, do not despair, trust in the Lord. Interesting that is repeated. As I was mulling over a little bit further about this train analogy and the thoughts of the trains, one thing that I became really aware of in thinking about these 3 incidents of the tree on the track and the man becoming unwell and the rerouted train, one thing that all of those incidents had in common was this. As we sat there waiting for the train to get moving again, there was one commonality. And it was this, that as we sat, and you can imagine the mumbling, people looking at their watches, checking their emails, calling people, so I'm going to be late for my meetings and so on. What happened as we waited was that on each of those 3 occasions, I was interested to note that the driver walked the length and the breadth of the whole train. Well, why did he do that, I wonder? Well, I'm not sure why he did that. I imagine that was good training, good protocol. But what he did was, as he came through each of the carriages, what I noticed was that the people around me all looked up. And as they looked up, there was this hope in their eyes, of course, to say, tell us what's going on. What's happening out there? When are we going to get on the move? Can you give us some hope, some reassurance, and tell us kind of how we get back on track? And what happened on each of those occasions was the driver was exactly able to do just that. On each of them, I heard him either right next to me at my table or further down the carriage, be able to give us reassurance of what was being done, tell us what was happening out there, tell us what was going to happen next, and actually reassure us that we could get on a safe track to our destination. And as I thought about that, the challenge that came to my mind was just how much do we, again, look to the driver? That actually sometimes there's that sense and the charge on us that we maybe need to, again, just in a fresh way, take the positive action, as we saw in each of those incidents, reset a little, but actually look to the driver. Because we know when we do that, don't we, that the Lord our God will always reassure, always bring insight, always bring wisdom for the times and the landscape that's beyond maybe what we can see. And on the train, we couldn't see what was going on, but he'll always faithfully give us that insight as to where we go next. And I don't know about you, but over the last few years, I've felt that is a really pivotal, important part of my job role, is to lean in and listen well to those who are around me, whether that's church leaders, network leaders, whatever, but to really prayerfully seek God as well for, God, what are you doing in this land? What are you saying to your church? What are the things that we're supposed to be noticing or hear from your heart about? And maybe that's the same for you too. Coming back to Joshua, I think he too had that reassurance, didn't he, for needing that sense of reassurance for his role, his purpose and hope in that situation. As we said, he surely felt a sense of fear or unworthiness, of shock or uncertainty in the midst of those times. And I'm sure that sense of looking left and looking right and feeling a bit of trepidation as to what God was calling him to. But I think just like that, the train situation, God calls Joshua to look up, doesn't he, and to look out. And there's verses which you'll be very familiar with, I'm sure, on our slide here, which I love and have always loved. In Joshua 1, verse 9, I've often quoted. It was only as I look back again afresh, you see it's mentioned at least 4 or 5 times in Joshua 1, this sense of, as these words say, be strong and courageous, Joshua. For you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land that I have sworn to their ancestors that I would give them. Be strong and courageous. There was this sense again of the calling out of Joshua into pastures new, into greater bravery or courage or confidence because of God's promises. And I don't know about you again, but it feels to me that we are in a time and season where we really need to encourage the church to step out with a bolder and braver confidence. I've had a few conversations even over the last 24 hours about how maybe the church has shrunk back because we've believed so much of the negative media about us, what people will or won't want to hear from us about, as Glenn was saying earlier, about us sharing life or sharing nuggets of our story of what God's done. And in light of that, I'd love to help us just for a few minutes to not just look up, but to look out at the landscape. We mentioned earlier about the Talking Jesus research, and it was my privilege to come last year and just for a few minutes share with you, for those who were here, just some of, which some of you might be familiar with, the Talking Jesus research, which looks like this. If you are interested in the research, if you haven't had a report, there are some copies certainly down here, which you're very welcome to take away with you. But I just want to share with you just a few, my 6 that stick, I like to call them. I'm not going to bombard you with them all, but 6 that stick from this UK research. And where it comes from, as some of you might know, is a 6-way partnership, which is ourselves at EA, along with Hope Together, along with some of our friends at the table over there, CV Global, along with Alpha, along with Kingsgate, and along with the Louis Plough Association. And we were 6 organisations who really wanted to map the state of faith across the UK. The reason being is that we wanted to take what was just great anecdote to actually look at the landscape and to map that with a credible research organisation. So, in the hope of really encouraging you, friends, as to what the landscape looks like, let me share with you the 6 that stick, and you'll see some of them on your screens. We were talking earlier, weren't we, again, as Glenn shared, but about this sense of openness, of conversation, and of discipleship, and where people have this sense of God or Jesus. And one of the first questions we asked was this. We asked, if you were to describe who Jesus is, across the UK, we asked this snapshot of over 4,000 people. We found this. So as you can see on your screen, 20% of the UK said that they would believe that Jesus is the Son of God. It's not encouraging. That 1 in 5 people around us, whilst there were 33% who said a prophet, a spiritual leader, a man, not God, or a normal human being, as you can see, 25%, but still 20% of the UK would say that they believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, therein lies a good conversation starter, doesn't it? We also went on to ask them this. If you think of the person of Jesus, you've described who you think he is, but what adjectives would you use? And again, this is what we found, as you can see on the screens here. So many positive responses. Top answer, that Jesus is spiritual, followed by peaceful. We see 37% say they recognise Jesus as being loving, 38% saying leader, and so on and so forth. A role model, moral, powerful, peaceful. Again, as Glenn was saying earlier, maybe not if we were asking ourselves without seeing the stats, we probably wouldn't have guessed that they were such positive responses. But doesn't that show, again, that actually maybe what we've fed ourselves, what we've believed, actually isn't altogether the case when we encounter our neighbours, people in our families, our communities, and so on. We went on to then say, okay, this is about the person of Jesus, but what about the resurrection? Well, you can see on your screen there that 41% of the UK would say that they don't believe in the resurrection. But if you put these top 2 stats together, 29 and 16%, you'll see that a whopping great 45% of the UK would say that they believe in the resurrection. Again, a phenomenal statistic, isn't it? Now, the breakdown you can see there is that 29% of people, there's a bit of a wobble factor. They believe that Jesus died and rose again, but not necessarily word for word as the Bible tells it. But 16% are our Bible-believing, practicing Christians who would say, yes, I believe that Jesus died and rose again. So there's a huge number of people in our communities and our spheres of influence who absolutely believe in the resurrection. We went on to ask this next question, and Glenn touched on this earlier, about the digital. To those outside the church, we asked, if you were to even start to explore faith, where would you go first? And this is what we found, that the top answer was Google. I don't know about you, many of us go to Google first, don't we, for anything? But 26% of the UK population said they would explore faith first through a digital presence. Not only that, as you can see on the screen, a further 10% said YouTube. So 36% of people, which I think speaks of the sense of anonymity and so on, that you can do that behind a screen, actually 36% would go to a digital presence first to explore things of faith. That should really challenge us, shouldn't it, in some of the ways as Glenn challenged us earlier. But what I love is the joint second top answer here too, which is that 22% of people said that they would seek out a local church. That's good for us, isn't it? And often for our 18 to 24-year-olds, we know that actually it's often the church building that they seek out for a place of encounter. And I've heard many stories of young adults going into church buildings that are open. Again, not always possible, is it, during the week and so on, but actually in those places having really deep spiritual encounters, even in that moment of a building. But for many others, it's engaging with church communities, coming to our buildings, coming to our services and so on. But I love too that, as you'll see, a further 22% of people said that they'd go to the Bible first. And this is reiterated through lots of other research, not just our own Talking Jesus research. The power and the sense that many, many, many people, currently not yet Christians outside the church, recognise the gravity of this book. Isn't it exciting? They may not know what's in it. They may not know the stories. They may not need somebody theologically trained to open it up with them. But they recognise that as they're seeking out life and truth and hope and purpose, that there's something about the Bible that has something to say. Hugely exciting, deeply challenging for us, even as Christians, to bring our own faith alive in getting to grips with the Bible and get it into people's hands. Just a couple more stats for you. We went on to ask people, and Glenn alluded to this earlier as well, if you know a practicing Christian, how would you describe them? Well, he mentioned earlier homophobic or naive, but actually, as you'll see here, he was totally right. Those come out incredibly low. You can see there, homophobic 5%. But what do people think of us? They like us, they know us, they trust us. They think we're friendly, we're caring, we're good-humoured, we're generous. All of these things should actually really make us sit up, shouldn't they, and say, oh, okay, that's a good starting point, isn't it? If they know us, they like us, then hopefully they trust us, which means that when you or I share snippets of stories, a moment or a word in season, something that God has done in our life whilst talking about the weather, the holidays, the football scores, whatever it may be, then actually, hopefully, they actually would start to process and think about some of these things as well. We went on to ask actually what people think about the church. This wasn't quite so positive. They think the church can be narrow-minded, that the church can be hypocritical, as you can see there in red. But if you cast your eyes to the top, it's not all bad news for us, even though it presents some challenge. They think we're friendly and we're caring. And so again, leaning in to people in our communities, it gives us hopefully a greater confidence again to be able to actually do life in the raw, in the real with people in our communities. Two more for you very briefly. One is one of the biggest, boldest, as you can see here on your screens, stats that came out of the Talking Jesus research was this, that when we ask people, if you've had that conversation with a practicing Christian that you know, whether it's in the pub, at the gym, in the playground, in the office, wherever it is, would you be willing and wanting to go further and learn a bit more? And we found remarkably that 1 in 3 people said yes. That yes, they'd want to know more, they'd be open to those conversations. So friends, I think this speaks to, doesn't it, this sense of a shift. And I'm sure many of you are aware of that. Why are we surprised? We've been through a lot, haven't we, in the last 5 years? You know, a global pandemic, the death of a queen, threat of war, ongoing threat of war, climate change, cost of living crisis, mental health needs, anxieties, you name it. actually, I think God has allowed some of this to shift people to a place, often in places of pain or trauma or concern. The biggest question that comes out of our research is people are asking, will everything be okay? But in the midst of that, actually, surely we see an opportunity, don't we, to say, everything may not always be rosy, but we know a God who is the rock of ages. He is absolutely faithful, always with you, and absolutely steadfast. So hopefully that encourages you, just as we look up to the driver, if you like, but out to the landscape. There is some real encouragement here. Now, just over the next few minutes, I'd love to give you a little Evangelists Conference exclusive. Is that all right? And that is because, as some of my friends here know, a couple of wonderful friends that we have, Glenn and Mark, on a group that we hold at the Evangelical Alliance called the Evangelism Advisory Group. And with our friends, we've been doing a new piece of research, which will be launched on the 3rd of June. And it's going to be called Finding Jesus, not Talking Jesus, Finding Jesus, but Identifying Pathways to Faith in Adulthood. And what we've wanted to do, so that hopefully it will serve church leaders, ministry leaders, evangelists like yourself, that actually we went after 100 people who've come to faith in the last 5 years, so 100 adults. The good news headline from the get-go is that we went after 100, asking people like yourselves, who do you know in your church, who's come to faith in the last 5 years, and we actually got just under 300 people. Which is a brilliant headline, isn't it? That actually, when we asked leaders, are you seeing people come to faith? We got almost 3 times as many. And we could have carried on. That was within our time frame. But I just would love to share with you a few little insights that, as Mark knows and others, we've been saying, don't share anything yet. But since we're doing it at the EA, I figure I've got license to go ahead. But just very briefly, I'd love to, again, I hope, just encourage, inspire you, challenge you maybe with some of these things. If we can flip forward a couple of slides to our Finding Jesus research, that would be great. So a couple of questions to share with you with those adults come to faith the last 5 years. We asked them this: what prompted you to begin exploring Christian faith? And as you can see on your screen, this is what we found, that for many people, it was these internal needs or challenges. As you can see, 37% of people said it was really in that place of needing help with life or looking for meaning, 34%. 32%, this is one that interests me the most, it was often born out of, as it says there, painful or difficult experience. And again, as we said earlier, I'm sure you know all too many people, maybe even in your own family context, we don't need to look too far afield often, do we? But actually in the midst of that rawness of life, how open people are to searching for the good news of the gospel. So to have a bit more boldness and braveness within that, hopefully, gives us some great opportunities. The next question we asked was this. We went on to ask them a bit more about what prompted them to be exploring faith. And we saw that it came out about the relationship that they had with the Christians that they know, that they saw the impact of Christianity in somebody that they knew. Therein lies a challenge as well, doesn't it? The sense, a call on us to live lives of holiness, to seek God, to grow ever more into his character, to be authentic, but to also model life in the real, in the raw, not pretending that life is always rosy. But isn't it, again, a good reminder that people look to us? They don't, not aspiring to be like us, but they see, as we said earlier, about how we do life and faith hand in hand. And I know from looking at my peers, even over the last year, goodness me, you know, the pain, the trauma, the parents who've been unwell, the worry about diagnosis, the worry about children and so on, where we can align with people and not pretend that our lives are any different, but align with people. Therein lies amazing opportunity, doesn't it, to speak the truth of the gospel. So people say, they would say that journey began from seeing the impact on Christianity on someone that they know. They also went on to say, as you'll see on the screen, that a Christian spoke to, if we can go back to the previous slide, that Christians spoke about their faith. Again, that charge on us to not just live it out, but to speak it out. That actually, again, to be that little bit bolder and braver actually really does count, doesn't it, in the midst of some of these circumstances. But also not just the words, but also the actions. 26% of people saying that it was the actions of a Christian towards me as well. The next little insight I'll give you was this. On the next slide, it shows not only where People said that their faith journey began because of the internal needs or their relationship with Christians. But I love this, that 28% of people went on to share with us that it was because they had a spiritual experience. And again, I don't know about you friends, but I am seeing and hearing this all the time. Aren't you? In part, it makes me sad. I sometimes think God is at power, his spirit is powerfully at work without us, because maybe we're not always doing a brilliant job to invite people and get them along. But isn't it encouraging that, as we said earlier, the church will never die. People will not stop coming to faith because God's Spirit is powerfully at work. And we are seeing and hearing that people are having these deep spiritual encounters, which I find personally incredibly exciting. And as part of the research, which will be launched, I'd love to share with you in June this year, but actually we're digging in through dialogues, we're digging into that. So tell me more about that. What happened in that spiritual encounter? Where were you? Who was involved? What happened? And whether it's answered prayers, visions, dreams, again, we're hearing so many of these different experiences, which is fascinating and very encouraging. A couple more bits to share with you. We went on to ask the next question, which was, what was significant as you explored Christian faith? Now, some of the stats on the screen would be very small, but I'll pick out a few. That 59% of people said it was really significant to them attending church. 47%, again, here we go, the Bible. 47% of people said it was reading the Bible that was absolutely transformative in their journeying towards Jesus. 42% of people said it was engaging in that community, a small group or a course. Alpha, Christianity Explored, Speak Life's resources, all of these that are just brilliant. And it was being on the inside of those small groups that helped them in that journey. 37% of people said it was answered prayer. And again, 39% of people said it was through that spiritual experience. So really exciting, hopefully insightful as well for us. And just lastly, I'd love to leave you with this stat from the Finding Jesus research, which is this. We asked people, what helped you the most from those people who were influential in your faith journeys? And this is what we found. Hopefully you can see on your screen that it was time. Time and time again, that sense of being present, being attentive and giving time. Not rocket science, is it? But actually, how challenging, but how important is it that it was that time spent one-to-one, doing life, having fun, going out for a curry or a drink, or whatever, but being intentional, side of a football pitch. I said, being intentional, prayerful, giving time was actually hugely transformative in people's journey towards Jesus. As you can see, also went on to share with us that actually it was that patient discussion. Interesting, the word patient there, isn't it? It wasn't just discussion backwards and forwards, but a sense of actually giving that time, patience, engaging with people, really intentionally, but probably listening, I'm sure, to the Lord in those conversations. Well, again, the authenticity of example, hospitality, and practical kindness. I hope, just in some small way, I've whet your appetite a little bit. For actually, not because it's our research, I'd love to serve you with that if that might be helpful. Our hope in actually asking these folk what was influential is that we draw out in this day, time and season some of the key missional trends. What's working? Where is God at work? What do people need? What do people want? Because I'm sure you'll agree with me, we sometimes presume we know the starting point, but we often don't, do we? And actually where people are asking, will everything be okay? They're reeling. What has gone from 1 in 5 people being open to a conversation to 1 in 3? Again, this unsettled nature of our communities, our culture, the churches that we're a part of, the friendship groups that we're a part of, the need for time, hopefully just encourages our hearts as well as challenges us, but gives us some insight as to how we can be effective in reaching people today as well. Just lastly, I hope that as we've looked at some of this, both looking up, that reminder of how we might look to the driver for that sense of reassurance, of knowing what the landscape looks like, of taking stock, of knowing where we're heading, but also looking out at the landscape and hearing some of these stats. I hope that it actually encourages us, but deeply challenges us. I don't know about you, but I think sometimes to be both encouraged and challenged is really good, isn't it, to have it hand in hand. If we're just encouraged, we pat ourselves on the back, don't we, and go, well done, we're doing a great job. Which in so many ways, thank God, there is so much to be encouraged by. But it's really good to together be challenged as well, isn't it? And to set our sights on the Lord and ask that he would use us, speak to us, guide us give us that strategy or scattergy, was it? That goes? I like that. On those 3 occasions that I mentioned of the train, what struck me was that actually, despite the turmoil, the not knowing, actually the charge upon us at the end was that we needed to keep going, head towards where we were ultimately heading for, as you do on a train, but to advance with confidence. And having sought after the driver, very wisely walking up and down the train to reassure us, actually we could advance and get to our destination. In my role, as I mentioned earlier, as head of mission, one of the things that I love the most is engaging with church leaders all over the UK. And as I said earlier, to really listen well and to ask them what's happening in their communities, in their leadership, in their context, and so on. But as a result of that, to be able to say to people, as I mentioned, God is doing this and doing this and doing this. My personal passion is that actually as leaders, we would do 2 things really. And certainly for me in speaking to the research, it's to see these 2 things. One, that we would, in our individual contexts, in our churches, in our ministries, in our small groups, that we would develop a culture of evangelism. That actually it doesn't become just the bolt-on or the all we should do, but actually whether we're running a youth ministry or a toddler group, whether we're serving seniors or a food bank or working with CAP, that actually that Christian distinctiveness and that culture of making Jesus known pervades all that we do. And in part of my work, I've spent an extraordinary amount of time with others developing a Talking Toddlers network. Why do we do that? I've had teenage boys. I'm way past the toddler stage, thankfully. But why do we do that? Because toddlers are one of the biggest mission fields of the church. Here's a sideline stat for you. 74%, through our Talking Toddlers research, 74% of all families with children under the age of 5, not just in the church, in the wider community, 74% of all families with children under the age of 5 attend a church-based toddler group. Isn't that astounding? Wow. Where is there a bigger mission field? Wow. The really good news is that and this is the pivotal point, where that toddler group has a Christian distinctiveness, so we're not just singing the wheels on the bus, but we're using Bible-based action songs, Bible stories, interspersed with all manner of other creative stories or whatever. But where there is a Christian distinctiveness, our research tells us that when we ask the adults, 55% of the adults who attend a church-based toddler group said that their own faith had been challenged or changed as a result of going. Isn't that encouraging? What does that say to us? Well, not only do we know the reasons that they come is because they've had a life event, often the birth of a baby. It might be a mum, a dad, a childminder, a grandparent, as you'll know, people who come to the toddler group. But they've had a life event. They want this young child to have a sense of moral compass, of Bible input, and so on. And so the challenge for us, again, as in that culture of evangelism, is if we don't use that opportunity, we're really missing a trick. Aren't we? They're in those places, in so many of our ministries, where people come to us, often in our church buildings, they expect us to speak of Jesus, just as Glenn was mentioning earlier too. So I don't know how you go into this year, but for me it's very much about wanting to that culture of evangelism, but also to see that confidence developed in every one of us so that actually we can just be a little bit bolder and braver in the year to come. And I've coined a bit of a phrase for myself, and speaking to this research over the last couple of years, I can only tell you it's deeply challenged me in so many ways in how I use my own social media, in giving away gospels with my Christmas presents that I've done over the last 3 years, prayerfully thinking, Lord, who should I give them to? And putting them in gift bags as they go out the door. And I've coined the phrase of, what's the worst that can happen? You know? If we speak a word in season, if we offer something whilst we're stood on the side of a football pitch, if we put a gospel into somebody's gift bag, what's the worst that can happen? Well, they can go, what's this? And put it in the bin. They might say, what's this? No, I might put it on a shelf. But do you know what, friends? They might just, because I've prayed over it as it's gone out of my door, they might just get a cup of tea, haven't they? Sit down over Christmas or in 6 months' time, and they might just open it thinking, what's this? And because of the transformative power of the Word of God and the Holy Spirit, the words might just hit them in that moment. And who knows what could happen. So I challenge myself as much as I challenge you in all of this. What's the worst that can happen? Let's just give it a go. You know, speak to your neighbour, your milkman, the person in the gym, the person you see and you walk by every day. But God gives you something to say. Just have a word, an encounter. Don't need to go full gospel. Just say hello. And who knows where the conversation will go. What's the worst that can happen? In my last couple of minutes, I'd love to just tell you a quick snapshot as I close of some of these good news stories. Over the last year, I'm thrilled to have seen some of those toddler groups have that greater passion to become distinctively Christian. Clevedon St Andrews, church where my parents go, their toddler group leader, Isabel, said to me just before Christmas, she said, I've been joining your Talking Toddlers webinars that we run in conjunction with Hope Together. And she said, I've got the team on board and we're making our toddler group sessions more Christian. And we've interspersed some of the Bible songs and so on. Brilliant. She's given it a go. The Send initiative, some of you might be familiar with, John McGinley and friends, who are calling out young people and young adults all across the UK and indeed globally. It's called The Send. They're calling them out to be sent. And I was at Wembley in July, 7th of July, I think 7,000 young people there were, seeking God, worshipping incredibly, and calling themselves out that God would equip them so that they would go and be sent. How encouraging. This is happening with our children, our young people, our young adults. The One Group, I have a friend, Matt, who's senior minister, Shirley Baptist Church, post-Alpha course, wondering what to do with these brilliant multicultural community of people that have joined in for Alpha, decides to come up with a concept to embed them into reading the Bible in a very light touch way. What I love about this is simplicity. Matt has created this concept called One, and it is 1 hour, 1 drink, 1 Bible passage, 1 big question. Brilliant. How simple. And what he's seeing is that not only have all of the Alpha group carried on, meeting in a pub or a cafe or someone's home, but actually people from the church who themselves have said that actually the Bible was not really alive to them for many years, have been just in the simplicity of 1 passage, 1 takeaway question, have just been seeing and saying the Bible has really come to life. We've got the privilege of Alex here, who heads up Faith in Later Life. It's been a joy this year to see church champions drawn out all over the UK to be working with seniors. Again, so many people do speak to Alex. The stories are phenomenal. But seeing so many older adults in slightly later life, but who may have been churchgoers for decades and yet actually coming to a real life revelatory faith in Jesus. In the midst of that, just a couple more to throw your way. I've been fascinated to have on at least 15 to 20 occasions now, church leaders say to me, and I've heard it in this room already in the last 24 hours, Rachel, I am seeing more people come into our churches as a direct result of having engaged with Christian content on TikTok, on YouTube, and in the digital presence. I've also heard people saying that they've had more baptisms in the last 2 years than they've had in the last 20 years. Friends, isn't this encouraging? Yeah. I hope that, as for me, I hope that this just lifts your heart, your soul, your confidence to actually just be saying, praise the Lord, God is on the move, isn't he good? And don't we want to be a part of it? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So just as we come into close, and I'd love to just have a moment for us just to pause and reflect, but when Joshua, going right back to what we were saying about the emergency cord, when Joshua had that emergency cord pulled on his life because Moses died, in that moment he had a choice, didn't he? And actually what we see, I believe, in that picture is that God helped Joshua take a really informed look at the missional landscape that they were in as he looked at what still needed to be accomplished across the nation of Israel. But in the midst of that, he gave Joshua his gracious promise, assurances of his presence, with some good advice about his own conduct and behaviour along the way. And he says in these verses that will come up on the screen that as Joshua, I'm sure, in that moment had a choice as to whether he sank and despaired, whether he thought, Lord, it's not me, that was Moses' job. Actually, what we see is, once again, coming back to this powerful verse in verse 9, when we're reminded, this is my command, be strong and very courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Why? Because the Lord your God is with you and me and you and you and you wherever you go. I'd love just in a moment, if that's okay, just a moment of pause, to just throw out 3 questions for you, maybe to take away. But the questions for you would just be this, and maybe just ponder on one of them even for 30 seconds or so. But as you go into the rest of today, and against the backdrop of hopefully what we've seen and heard of the mission landscape and the openness, but also digging into the character and the call of Joshua for this time and season as he faced and as we face, my questions for you would be this: where or are you feeling at all demoralised, even despairing, and where might you need to ask God to raise your gaze at the start of a new year, to pull the emergency cord, to stop that downward spiral like the whirlpool, but to take stock and reset for the year ahead? If that's you, I'm sure that this week God will encounter you to reassure you and to just abort the negative feeling, to set your sights, raise your gaze and fix your eyes on him. The second question is this: how can you further encourage that culture of evangelism in your context so that you can see through that individuals released into that greater confidence to share Jesus? And lastly, more personally, maybe in what areas of your life do you want God to make you stronger and more courageous so that in your service over the coming year, actually you might really sense and feel and know that God is making you indeed stronger and more courageous? Maybe it's just as we pause, let me read that verse for us again and then just pray for us if that's okay, and then I'll hand back. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Rachel. If you would like to know more about the Evangelists Conference, please visit evangelistconference.com.